So I played the original BioShock for the first time a few months ago because of its reputation as a stellar game, and what do you know, I really enjoyed it. The shooting and survival elements were very fun and creative, but it was the world of Rapture I found most compelling about this title. Not only is the idea of this underwater metropolis gone to hell an instantly alluring one, but the Art Deco aesthetic, old school needle drops, and the storytelling within the environment and interview tapes gave it a truly engrossing atmosphere. But while BioShock is considered a classic, I think its sequel proved rather divisive, and it wasn't really a game I heard much about prior to getting into this series. And now that I've played it for myself, I wanted to share my take on the game, so here we go with my review of BioShock 2. We're back in Rapture in 1968, some years after the events of the first game. This time around, the city is run under the cult-like presence of Sophia Lamb, and you play as a big daddy known as Subject Delta. The goal is to rescue a grown-up little sister called Eleanor from Lamb's control, fending off some of Rapture's more colourful inhabitants along the way. I couldn't help but notice multiple scenes were repeated from the first, especially early on, and it is hard to shake off a general sense of deja vu throughout a lot of this experience. So naturally, this does lack a lot of the impact the first game had, but the story is still pretty good and very well told. It expands the world of Rapture in rather interesting ways, and the atmosphere remains as enveloping as before, backed up by the once again richly written dialogue and compelling interview tapes, and certain concepts like being guided by the past recordings of Gil Alexander, who wants you to kill his now insane self, are really cool in concept and execution. Plus, I do think the developers were at least somewhat aware of the fact old ground was being retreaded narratively, because they do try to subvert the player's expectations in certain parts, like with Sinclair, your new radio companion, who, given what went down with Atlas in the previous game, I was immediately suspicious of. Because of this, the game wants you to wait for some grand reveal of an ulterior motive from him, which never comes. But I did think to myself early on that the game probably wanted me to be suspicious of him, and so he'd turn out to be an honest-to-God good guy. And of course, that's exactly what happens. These types of expectations for what the game may think to do differently or not meant the whole morality thing it tries to expand on from the first game falls a bit flat. I mean, in all honesty, I found the good and bad ending part of the first game kind of weird, particularly with a blank slate protagonist, but playing as a big daddy this go around means it just doesn't make any sense to harvest the little sisters, especially as I know the Adam rewards will even out if I save them. Then there's parts where you get the choice to kill or spare some of the main characters, but playing in the knowledge of there being multiple endings, I didn't give the choice any thought as I knew sparing them would most likely lead to the best outcome. The actual final scenes do work a little better than they do in the first, but the choice making aspect wasn't as involving as it should have been. Calling this game BioShock 1.5 is a fair analogy, but one that shouldn't immediately be considered a derogatory one, so long as the gameplay retains what made the original work and what new changes there aren't too detrimental to the experience. There's nothing wrong with being largely more of the same, so let's see if this is just as enjoyable to play as its predecessor. One change I took for granted at first was being able to use plasmid abilities and weapons simultaneously without having to switch between the two, which is a really useful update. The other big shake-up to the formula is scrapping the whole pipe hacking minigame, replacing it with a shorter timing-based one instead. While the pipe puzzle got old after a while, I did sort of miss it here, although its replacement is fine enough. Aside from those, the basic formula is more or less the same deal as before. I'm a real sucker for exploration in games, especially when the locations are linear enough to compel me to check every nook and cranny for loot and those tapes which flesh out the environment and characters further. It's an easy way to get me immersed and engaged with a game world, and this is no exception. The action remains simple but satisfying. Using a mix of plasmids and guns works as well as before, and the new weapons and abilities all feel great to use. It's basically unchanged except for the frequency of attacks you'll be facing as you traverse. The first game had a good balance between fighting and having lots of time to absorb the environment, but the further along I got in 2, the more it outright became a full-fledged action game. And I really didn't like that. The shooting may be fun and can offer a few creative options for taking down your opponents, but there's still not enough to it to build the majority of the game around it. Because not only does it get really repetitive, but thanks to the survival-esque elements, oftentimes I'd run out of bullets and would be respawned where I couldn't get ammo and would be quickly killed again, and it would become this whole ordeal. And then there's the Big Sisters. Oh my god, the Big Sisters annoyed the crap out of me. They'll appear, I think, at random with all this build-up, which is initially cool but happens every time you die if you haven't killed it yet, which loses the suspense and becomes really irritating. I know some people have an issue with the Vita Chambers reviving you and keeping the enemy's health bar to what you knocked it down to, but I never minded because BioShock is just as much about story and exploration as it is survival. And god, some parts in the back half of this game would have been even more of a chore to get through if I had to start from scratch every time. This simply isn't the type of game where I want to be constantly bombarded with action, and so BioShock 2 is an odd one for me. I was definitely really into it for the first couple of hours, and I like the way it fleshes out this universe, but playing in the moment, the overabundance of enemies was far and away the main vocal point. The more I've reflected on the experience as a complete whole, the more I think it's just fine. The first was such a memorable journey, and this sequel doesn't quite do enough to set itself apart from its predecessor. I'm still eager to check out Infinite, but while there was a lot of really interesting things here in regard to narrative and atmosphere, I was rather tired of actually playing it by the end.